communion wine tastes like copper pennies and rain. Father Ezekiel Morrow sets the chalice down on the oak altar and watches 43 pairs of empty eye sockets follow his every movement. The morning light filters through stained glass windows, painting rainbow streaks across weathered bone and tattered funeral clothes. His congregation sits perfectly still in their pews, spines straight, hands folded in their laps like they've been practicing good posture for decades. Which they have. "Let us pray," Ezekiel says, his voice echoing in the small stone chapel. 43 skulls tilt forward in unison, and he can see the words carved into their foreheads now. Delicate script etched deep into bone, filled with what looks like dried ink but smells like burnt matches. Rule 1. The service must begin when the church bell rings 5 times. Rule 2. Every prayer shall be spoken thrice, no more, no less. Rule 3. The offering bowl must hold something from the living world. Rule 4. No word may be spoken by the dead during sacred hours. Rule 5. The candles must burn until the sun touches the horizon. Ezekiel learned these rules the hard way during his first week. Constance Blackwood, who sits in the third pew wearing her wedding dress from 1847, had turned her skull toward him when he'd only repeated the Lord's Prayer twice. The sound her neck bones made while rotating still visits him during quiet moments. "Our Father, who art in heaven," he begins, and 43 mouths open. No sound comes out, but he can see their jawbones moving, keeping perfect time with his words. Dry tongues click against teeth that have long since lost their enamel. "Our Father, who art in heaven," he repeats, louder this time. The third repetition makes his throat raw, but Matthias Grimm in the front row nods his approval. Matthias died choking on communion bread in 1823, and his neck still bears the indentation where the wafer lodged itself. He takes the rules seriously. After the prayers, Ezekiel walks down the center aisle with the offering bowl. It's made from what the town records claim is pewter, but Ezekiel knows better. The metal is too warm, too eager to drink in whatever he places inside. Today, he drops in a handful of wildflowers he picked on his walk from the parsonage. The bowl hums softly, and the flowers begin to wilt immediately. "Your offerings nourish us," he tells his congregation, though he's never sure exactly what they're being nourished for. Temperance Ashford raises her hand. She's been dead for 93 years, but her Sunday dress still holds its shape around her rib cage. Ezekiel nods at her. She points one bony finger at the windows. Outside, storm clouds are gathering despite the morning sunshine, the kind of weather that makes living people nervous and dead people excited. "Thank you, Sister Temperance," Ezekiel says. "We'll prepare accordingly." He walks to the supply closet behind the pulpit and retrieves the rain bucket. It's another piece of equipment that came with the position, along with the ceremonial shovel and the leather-bound journal where he records attendance. The bucket is made from the same material as the offering bowl, and it practically vibrates with anticipation when storm weather approaches. Ezekiel places the bucket beneath the largest stained glass window, the one depicting St. Peter holding his keys, though Peter's face has been worn smooth by decades of rain that somehow finds its way inside, despite the sealed glass. The first droplets begin to fall as Ezekiel returns to the altar. The sound they make hitting the bucket is different from normal rain. Heavier, more musical, like coins dropping into a collection plate. "Let us sing," Ezekiel announces, opening his hymnal to a page he's memorized. The book is bound in leather that feels too much like skin, but he's learned not to think about such things during service hours. His voice fills the chapel as he sings "Rock of Ages." Behind him, 43 pairs of jaws move silently along, creating a soft, clicking rhythm that somehow harmonizes with his melody. Prudence Holloway, who died of tuberculosis in 1901, taps her finger bones against the pew in time with the music. The rain falls harder now, and the bucket begins to glow with a faint amber light. Ezekiel doesn't look directly at it while he sings. That's another rule he discovered on his own, written nowhere but learned through experience. Some things in St. Bartholomew's Chapel are better observed through peripheral vision. When the hymn ends, he faces his congregation again. Jeremiah Stake in the back row has his hand raised. Jeremiah died in a barn fire in 1856, and his skull still bears scorch marks around the temples. His questions are usually important. Ezekiel nods, and Jeremiah points toward the chapel door. Someone is knocking. The living rarely visit St. Bartholomew's Chapel. The road leading to it was officially closed in 1967, and most maps printed after 1975 don't show it at all. But occasionally, hikers stumble across the overgrown path, or researchers looking for historical sites find references in old documents. Ezekiel walks to the heavy wooden door and opens it slowly. A young woman stands on the stone steps, soaked from the rain despite the covered porch. She's maybe 25, wearing jeans and a University of Vermont sweatshirt. Her dark hair sticks to her face, and she's shivering. "Oh, thank God," she says, pushing past him into the chapel. "I've been walking for hours, and my car broke down, and my phone has no signal, and I saw the light from your windows." She stops mid-sentence. 43 skulls have turned toward her, and the silence in the room has weight to it. "I'm sorry," she whispers, backing toward the door. "I didn't realize you were having a service. I'll just... Please," Ezekiel says gently. "Don't leave during sacred hours. It's not safe." The woman looks at him, then at his congregation, then back at him. Her name is probably something modern like Jessica or Ashley, names that would sound out of place next to Temperance and Constance. But she's living, and that makes her different from everyone else in the room. "What kind of church is this?" she asks. Ezekiel considers how to answer. The truth would send her screaming into the storm, where other things wait for people who run from St. Bartholomew's Chapel after dark. Things that make his congregation look welcoming by comparison. "We're a small denomination," he says instead. "Very traditional. Please sit wherever you'd like. We'll be finished soon." The woman chooses a pew near the back, next to Barnabas Frost. Barnabas died of pneumonia in 1834, and he's always been good with newcomers. His skull turns toward her and nods politely. She nods back, probably thinking he's wearing some kind of Halloween mask. Ezekiel returns to the altar and continues the service. The rain bucket is nearly full now, glowing brighter with each drop. He can feel his congregation's attention shifting between him and their living visitor. They're curious about her, the way children are curious about a new toy. During the final prayer, spoken 3 times as always, the woman joins in. Her voice sounds strange, mixed with his, too warm and too alive. But his congregation doesn't seem to mind. If anything, they lean forward slightly, as if trying to catch every word. When the service ends, Ezekiel blows out the altar candles. The rain has stopped, and afternoon sunlight streams through the windows again. His congregation rises in unison, 43 chairs creaking as they stand. They file out through a side door that leads to the cemetery, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who have somewhere important to be. The woman watches them go. "Interesting costumes," she says. "Are you guys reenactors or something?" "Something like that," Ezekiel agrees. He walks over to the rain bucket, which has cooled to its normal temperature. The water inside looks ordinary now, but he knows it will serve its purpose when the time comes. "I'm Father Ezekiel Morrow," he says, extending his hand. "Welcome to St. Bartholomew's." "Sarah Combe," she replies, shaking his hand. Her skin is warm and slightly damp from the rain. "Look, I hate to impose, but is there any chance I could use your phone? My car died about 3 miles down the road, and I really need to call for help." Ezekiel pauses. Her last name troubles him in a way he can't quite explain. There's something familiar about it. something that makes the back of his neck itch. "Of course," he says, "the phone is in the vestry, but I should warn you, the connection can be unreliable during storms." Sarah follows him to a small room behind the altar. The phone is an old rotary model that came with the building, black bakelite that feels cold, even on warm days. She picks up the receiver and listens for a dial tone. "Nothing," she says, hanging up. "Maybe the storm knocked out the lines." "That happens sometimes," Ezekiel agrees, though he knows the phone hasn't worked since 1983. "You're welcome to wait here until morning. The parsonage has a guest room." Sarah looks around the vestry, taking in the religious paintings and wooden crosses on the walls. Everything appears normal, carefully maintained and appropriately humble for a small country chapel. "That's very kind of you," she says. "But won't your wife mind having a stranger in the house?" "I'm not married," Ezekiel says. "The position requires celibacy." "What position?" "I'm the appointed caretaker for this congregation. Have been for 15 years. Sarah nods, though something in her expression suggests she finds this arrangement odd. Most people would. A man in his 30s dedicating his entire adult life to ministering to fewer than 50 people in a chapel that doesn't appear on modern maps. "Well, if you're sure it's no trouble," she says. "None at all. We don't get many visitors." They walk back through the chapel toward the main door. The afternoon light has changed, taking on the golden quality that comes before sunset. Ezekiel can see his congregation through the windows, moving among the tombstones in the cemetery. They're performing their evening duties, tending to graves and organizing the flower arrangements that appear fresh every morning, despite being decades old. "Your parishioners are very dedicated," Sarah observes. "They have been for quite some time." "How long have they been coming here?" Ezekiel considers the question. "How do you explain that some of them have been attending services since before the Civil War? That their dedication extends far beyond what most people would consider normal, or even possible?" "Most of them have family buried in the cemetery," he says instead. "It creates a strong connection to the church. This is true in a sense. They all have family in the cemetery, themselves." As they reach the door, Sarah stops and looks back at the altar. "Father Morrow, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "During the service, when everyone was praying, I could have sworn I saw words written on their foreheads. Like tattoos, but carved in. Was that part of the costume?" Ezekiel's hand tightens on the door handle. "Living people aren't supposed to see the rules. The carvings only become visible to those who've been called to serve, or those who've been marked for joining the congregation. The light can play tricks," he says carefully. "Stained glass creates interesting patterns." Sarah nods, but her expression remains troubled. It just seems so real and specific, like there were rules written there. "Rules?" "Instructions about the service, how many times to repeat prayers, when to light candles, that sort of thing." Ezekiel opens the door and steps onto the porch. The evening air is cool and clean, washed fresh by the rain. He can hear his congregation moving through the cemetery, their footsteps soft on the wet grass. "Many traditional churches have specific liturgical requirements," he says. "Perhaps you've seen similar services before and recognized the patterns." Sarah follows him outside, but she keeps looking back at the chapel windows. "Maybe. It's just, I've never felt anything like that before. Like I belonged somewhere I'd never been." They walk down the stone path toward the parsonage, a small white house tucked between two ancient oak trees. Ezekiel built it himself during his first year, using lumber that appeared in neat stacks behind the chapel every morning, until he had enough for the entire structure. He never questioned where the wood came from, just as he never questions where the fresh flowers in the cemetery originate, or why the chapel's foundation stones remain warm even during winter. Some aspects of his calling require faith rather than understanding. The parsonage is simple but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room with a fireplace. The guest room contains a single bed with clean white sheets and a wooden cross on the wall. Sarah sets her backpack on the dresser and looks around. "This is lovely," she says. "Very peaceful. I hope you'll be comfortable. Dinner is usually around 6, if you'd like to join me." "That sounds wonderful. Thank you again for your kindness." Ezekiel leaves her to rest and walks to the kitchen to prepare the evening meal. Through the window, he can see his congregation finishing their cemetery duties. Constance Blackwood is arranging lilies on a grave that hasn't had a body in it for over a century. Matthias Grimm is polishing a headstone with his bare finger bones, working with the patience of someone who has literally all the time in the world. As the sun begins to set, they'll return to their own graves for the night. Each will lie down in their designated plot and wait for the morning bell to call them back to service. It's a routine they've followed for decades, and one that brings them comfort. But tonight feels different. Tonight they have a living witness to their devotion. Someone who can see the rules carved into their skulls. Someone whose last name echoes in Ezekiel's memory like a half-remembered prayer. He opens the leather-bound journal where he records daily attendance and flips through the pages. Names, dates, notes about weather and special circumstances. 15 years of faithful service documented in his careful handwriting. Near the beginning of the journal, he finds what he's looking for. An entry from his second week as caretaker, when he was still learning the rules and responsibilities of his position. October 15th, discovered additional records in the basement archives. Previous caretaker, Father Marcus Combe, served from 1962 to 2010. Died of natural causes. Buried in Section C, Plot 44. Congregation voted him into eternal service by unanimous consent. Ezekiel closes the journal and looks out the window again. Plot 44 is visible from the kitchen, marked by a simple gray headstone. Someone has placed fresh marigolds beside it, just as they do every evening. He thinks about Sarah's last name, about the way she could see the rules, about how naturally she joined in the final prayer. Some people are called to serve St. Bartholomew's Chapel. Others are called to join its congregation. And sometimes those callings run in families. Outside, the church bell begins to ring. 5 measured tolls that echo across the cemetery and through the trees. His congregation responds immediately, 43 figures moving with purpose toward their resting places for the night. Ezekiel watches until the last of them disappears into the earth. Then he turns back to his dinner preparations, humming the melody of Rock of Ages while he works. In the guest room, Sarah Combs sits on the edge of the bed, looking out her window at the cemetery. The headstones glow softly in the moonlight, and she could swear she sees movement among them. Not threatening or frightening, but purposeful, like people going home after a long day of meaningful work. She touches her forehead, where she'd felt a strange tingling sensation during the service. Her fingers trace letters she can't see but somehow knows are there, carved in a script that feels both foreign and familiar. Rule 6, she thinks, though she doesn't understand where the thought comes from. Rule 6, those who see the words are chosen to learn them. Dinner consists of bread that tastes like communion wafers, and soup that steams without any heat beneath the pot. Sarah sits across from Ezekiel at the small kitchen table, stirring her bowl while watching the liquid swirl in patterns that remind her of the stained glass windows. She hasn't eaten much, but she hasn't complained either. Most living people find the parsonage food difficult to stomach. "Tell me about your family," Ezekiel says, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not much to tell. My parents died when I was 12. Car accident. I was raised by my grandfather until he passed last year." Sarah sets down her spoon and looks directly at him. "He used to tell me stories about a relative who became a priest, said he served some tiny church up in the mountains until he died." "What was his name?" "Marcus. Marcus Combe. Grandpa always said he was the holiest man in our family, but also the loneliest." She pauses, studying Ezekiel's face. You know something about him, don't you? Ezekiel nods slowly. Father Combe was my predecessor. He served this congregation for 48 years. 48 years? In this one little church? It becomes a calling that's difficult to leave. Sarah pushes her bowl away and leans back in her chair. Father Morrow, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. What's really going on here? Your congregation doesn't behave like any people I've ever seen. They don't talk. They move like they're following choreography, and I swear I can see writing carved into their faces. What kind of writing? Rules? Instructions. Like someone took a knife and etched commandments into their skulls. She touches her forehead again, and Ezekiel notices the gesture has become unconscious. And I think I'm starting to see them on myself. Ezekiel sets down his own spoon and considers his words carefully. He's had this conversation before, though not often. Most living people who stumble across St. Bartholomew's Chapel leave quickly and never return. The few who stay usually do so because they've been called to serve, either as caretaker or as congregation. The rules exist to maintain order, he says finally. They ensure that services run smoothly and that everyone understands their role. But why carve them into bone? Why not just write them down like normal churches do? Normal churches serve living congregations. Our requirements are different. Sarah stands and walks to the window overlooking the cemetery. Full darkness has fallen, and the headstones seem to glow with their own internal light. She can see figures moving among them, tending to graves and arranging flowers that bloom despite the season. They're dead, aren't they? She says without turning around. Your entire congregation is dead. Yes. How long? The oldest died in 1823. The most recent joined us in 2010. Sarah turns back to face him. 2010. That's when my great-uncle Marcus died. Your great-uncle was a good man. He served faithfully and died peacefully in his sleep. The congregation voted to offer him eternal service, and he accepted. Eternal service. Ezekiel gestures toward the cemetery. They continue their worship after death. They attend services, maintain the grounds, and follow the rules that govern their existence here. It brings them peace. And what about you? What happens when you die? I assume I'll be offered the same choice. Sarah returns to her seat, but her posture has changed. She sits straighter, more alert, like someone who's finally understanding the rules of a game she's been playing without knowing it. The writing on my forehead, she says. What does it say? Ezekiel hesitates. Once he speaks the words aloud, there will be no pretending this is all coincidence or imagination. Sarah will have to make a choice, just as he did 15 years ago when he stumbled across this chapel as a lost seminary student. Rule 6, he says quietly. Those who see the words are chosen to learn them. Learn them how? By living them, by serving, by becoming part of the community that exists here. Sarah absorbs this information without visible emotion. She's calmer than most people would be upon learning they've been marked for recruitment by a congregation of the dead. What are my options? She asks. You can leave in the morning, drive back to your regular life and forget this place exists. The rule will fade from your forehead and you'll never see it again. Or you can stay, learn the other rules. Take your place either as congregation or caretaker. What's the difference? Ezekiel looks out the window at his faithful dead, still working among their graves as they do every night. Congregation members serve until they're called home to whatever comes after this existence. Caretakers serve until they die, then choose whether to continue in eternal service or move on to their final rest. How do you know all this? The same way you're learning it now, through experience and faith. Sarah drums her fingers on the table, a rhythmic tapping that sounds like rain on the chapel roof. My great-uncle Marcus. Is he happy here? Would you like to ask him yourself? They walk back to the chapel through the cool night air. The building looks different in darkness, more alive somehow. Light flickers in the windows despite no electric power running to the structure, and the bell tower stands outlined against stars that seem unusually bright. Inside, 43 figures wait in their pews. They've returned from their evening duties and assembled for what Ezekiel calls night prayer, though it's not listed in any liturgical calendar. Sarah recognizes some of them from the morning service, but others must have been working in distant parts of the cemetery. Sarah Combe, Ezekiel announces, has come to speak with Marcus Combe. A figure in the front row stands and turns toward them. Even in the dim light, Sarah can see the family resemblance in the shape of his skull and the set of his shoulders. He wears the black suit he was buried in, still pressed and clean despite 13 years in the ground. Marcus approaches slowly, and Sarah can see the rules carved into his forehead now. All 5 original rules, plus others she doesn't recognize. His eye sockets are empty, but somehow she knows he's looking directly at her. "Hello, Uncle Marcus," she says. He can't speak during sacred hours, so he nods instead. Then he reaches into his jacket pocket and produces a small leather journal. He hands it to Sarah and gestures for her to read. The journal contains his handwriting, familiar from birthday cards and Christmas letters she'd received as a child. The entries begin 48 years ago and end the day before his death. "The calling came to me in dreams first," she reads aloud. "A voice telling me to find St. Bartholomew's Chapel and minister to those who needed guidance in their eternal rest. I thought it was madness, until I found this place and met my congregation. They taught me that death is not an ending, but a transformation of service." She flips through more pages, finding accounts of services and seasonal celebrations, notes about individual congregation members and their needs, observations about the spiritual growth that continues even after physical death. Near the end, she finds an entry dated just a week before his death. "I have lived a full life in service to the faithful dead. When my time comes, I hope to continue this work from the other side. But I sense my family line is not finished here. Someone else bears the gift of sight, someone who will be called when the time is right." Sarah closes the journal and looks at her great-uncle. "Did you know I would come here?" Marcus nods and points to himself, then to her, then to the altar. The meaning is clear. He served. Now she must choose whether to serve. "What happens if I say yes?" Ezekiel steps forward. "You would learn the rules that govern this place. You would help maintain the spiritual needs of the congregation. You would live in the parsonage and conduct services until your natural death, at which point you could choose eternal service or final rest. And if I say no, you leave in the morning with our blessing, the mark will fade and you'll forget this place exists." Sarah looks around the chapel at the assembled dead. They watch her with patient attention, 43 souls who have found purpose in continuing their worship beyond the grave. She thinks about her ordinary life, her job at the university library, her small apartment where she lives alone, and counts the days until weekends. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until morning," Ezekiel says. "The choice must be made before the sun rises." Sarah spends the rest of the night walking through the cemetery, reading headstones and learning the stories of her potential congregation. Constance Blackwood, devoted wife and mother, died of influenza in 1847, but continued tending to other families' graves. Matthias Grimm, who choked on communion bread but never lost his faith in the sacred meal. Temperance Ashford, a seamstress who now mends the burial clothes of newcomers. Each headstone tells a story of people who chose to continue serving after death, who found their earthly purpose so meaningful they couldn't bear to abandon it, even when their bodies failed. Near dawn, she finds herself standing before plot 44, where a simple gray stone reads, "Father Marcus Combe, 1962 to 2010, faithful servant of God and his people. Fresh marigolds rest beside the stone, placed there by congregation members who remember his decades of care. Sarah kneels and touches the earth above his grave. "I understand now, Uncle Marcus," she whispers. "You weren't the loneliest man in our family. You were the luckiest. You found a purpose worth keeping forever." The church bell begins to ring as the first rays of sunlight touch the chapel windows. 5 measured tolls calling the faithful to morning service. Sarah stands and brushes dirt from her knees, decision made. She finds Ezekiel waiting in the vestry, already dressed in his ceremonial robes. He looks at her face and nods. "The mark has deepened," he observes. "You can see all the rules now, can't you?" Sarah touches her forehead, feeling the carved letters that have appeared during the night. 5 rules that will govern her service, plus the 6th that brought her here. "What happens to you now?" she asks. "I've served 15 years, Ezekiel says. "That's longer than most caretakers manage. I'm ready for retirement." "Retirement?" He smiles and points toward the cemetery. "Plot 45 has been waiting for me since the day I arrived. I always knew this position was temporary." "You're going to die?" "I'm going to rest. There's a difference." He hands her a set of vestments identical to his own. "The congregation voted last night. They're ready to accept you as their new caretaker." Sarah puts on the robes, and they fit perfectly despite being cut for someone a foot taller. Everything about St. Bartholomew's Chapel adjusts to meet the needs of those called to serve. "Do you have any final questions?" Ezekiel asks. "Just one. What happens to people who stumble across this place by accident? People who aren't called? They see a ruined chapel with broken windows and a collapsed roof. They take a few pictures for social media and drive away, never suspecting that services continue every day inside walls they can't perceive." Sarah nods, understanding. The chapel exists in a space between worlds, visible only to those meant to find it. They walk together into the main sanctuary, where 43 souls wait patiently in their pews. Ezekiel takes his place at the altar for the final time, and Sarah stands beside him to observe her first service as caretaker-elect. "Let us pray," Ezekiel begins, and 43 mouths open in silent unison. After the service, the congregation files out to begin their daily duties. Marcus Combe pauses beside Sarah and places one skeletal hand on her shoulder. The touch is neither cold nor warm, but it carries the weight of blessing and welcome. Ezekiel removes his vestments and folds them carefully. "The transition is complete," he says. "Thank you for answering the call. Thank you for keeping them safe until I could get here." He nods and walks toward the door. Sarah follows, watching as he steps into the morning sunlight and begins the short walk to the cemetery. His pace is unhurried, like someone finally going home after a long journey. At plot 45, Ezekiel lies down on the freshly turned earth. He closes his eyes and folds his hands across his chest, and Sarah watches as the ground gently accepts him, not swallowing or consuming, but embracing like an old friend. A simple wooden marker appears at the head of the grave. Father Ezekiel Morrow, 2010 to 2025, faithful servant called to eternal rest. Sarah walks back to the chapel alone, though she doesn't feel lonely. 43 voices wait inside to help her learn the rhythms of this place, and a journal full of blank pages sits on the altar, ready for her to record the continuation of their story. She rings the bell 5 times, calling the faithful to evening service. Through the windows, she can see them emerging from the cemetery, moving with purpose toward the chapel they've called home for decades or centuries. The communion wine tastes like copper pennies in rain, but Sarah drinks it gratefully. She has found her calling, her congregation has found their new caretaker, and the eternal service continues. In the front pew, Marcus Combe nods his approval as his great-niece begins her first prayer as keeper of St. Bartholomew's Chapel. The rules carved into her forehead glow softly in the candlelight, and her voice fills the sanctuary with the sound of prayers that will be spoken for generations to come. Some callings are inherited, some are chosen. The best ones are both.